Distinguished delegates, may I request that you take your seats so that we can start this meeting in 2 minutes. Madam Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I now declare the third working group session of the multilateral assessment under the third cycle of the international assessment and review process open. I would like to welcome all participants to this event under the SBI, and in particular the representatives of Austria, Belgium, Bulgaria, Cyprus, Greece, and Kazakhstan, who will undergo the multilateral assessment this morning. I am looking forward to conducting another successful MA session with constructive interaction amongst parties. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce a distinguished guest who will deliver some introductory remarks. I would like, therefore, to invite the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC Secretariat, Mrs. Patricia Espinosa, to give some welcome remarks to this meeting. Madam Executive Secretary, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you this morning. Let me welcome you to this COP of Latin America and the Caribbean, and it gives me great pleasure also to, as a national from one of the Latin American countries, to welcome you all to this Latin American and Caribbean COP that is being held actually in Europe, but also in a Latin and a Spanish-speaking country. I hope that you have well survived the first week of our work, and that you are taking good care of yourselves and you are ready to embark in the last stretch of our very intensive work here at this conference. I do want to thank all of you for your leadership and the commitment that you have shown to a transparent and open assessment process. Your efforts are essential if we hope to reach our collective goal of limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. To do that, we know that we must reduce emissions by 45% by 2030, and we must achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. We can achieve these goals, but only if we move forward with urgency. We are, however, still running behind. Carbon emissions are rising at their fastest rate since 2011. Levels of CO2 in the atmosphere have never been higher during human life. The impact of the climate on the climate is clear. Massive forest fires, devastating heat waves, powerful hurricanes, unprecedented droughts, and more. Last night I was watching the news and I was watching how difficult the situation is right now in Australia because of the bushfires and the pollution and the air quality that has become a real problem for the whole society, but especially for children, people, and elderly children, youth, and elderly people. So it is very clear that we are facing a climate emergency throughout the world, and we need solutions now. The demonstration yesterday here in Madrid and in other places of the globe really shows this call for reacting to this sense of emergency. And each day that has passed at COP25, we have received more and more science, good science backed by years of research that tells us that we are not on the right path, that we are actually going in the wrong direction. This is the 25th anniversary of UN climate change. And in those 25 years, the science that provides the foundation of our work has grown to become more and more precise. The warnings have never been clearer. This last year alone, we've had 3 reports from the IPCC that in no uncertain terms tell us we are poisoning the very elements that keep us alive in this planet. We received the UNEP GAP report that says emissions continue to go up. We received the 10 new insights in climate science 2019 the other day, actually just yesterday, that said much of the same. And while we value this report, we value the science, I ask you this. How many new reports do we need to have before we really start acting with the urgency we claim to have? How much longer before we really begin the deep transformation that we need to see? We simply must go faster. Ladies and gentlemen, the window of opportunity is about to close. I have been saying for a long time, the window of opportunity is very small. Now I'm saying the window of opportunity is about to close. We need decisions now. To address this emergency, we need decisions now and to see truly transformative climate action by all sectors of society. With respect to parties, we need to assess the progress made so far, both to ensure we are on track and to inform the work to come. And this is why today's meeting, this assessment is so important. It is especially important also as nations look towards boosting their long-term strategies and nationally determined contributions in 2020. In other words, we must show through our deeds and not just our words that we are working to achieve the goals under the Paris Agreement. And all of this depends on a transparent process. Transparency is at the heart of effective national and international climate actions. It helps us learn through an open exchange of ideas. This transparency, this exchange of ideas is directly tied to building the climate ambition we so urgently need. We don't have time for guesswork. We need to know one simple truth. Are we where we need to be or not? Are we on track to getting where we need to be or not? It's not about one side working against the other. It's about all segments of society working together multilaterally to address this climate crisis we collectively face. The idea that multilateralism is the only way to address climate change has been the goal of this entire process in the last 25 years, from the creation of the Convention, through the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, and the work we do daily. And it remains the way forward. At today's multilateral assessment, we will hear about your progress. And I do want to thank all the countries that will be presenting the report today. This includes stronger mitigation policies and measures for reaching the 2020 emission targets. It's an important opportunity to share and learn from each other. And while it is important to celebrate our progress and identify areas for improvement, we must never forget the big picture. The way forward must be one of steadily rising climate ambition. Half measures will get us nowhere. We either enact the deep transformation of society that is required to achieve our climate goals, or we will find ourselves at the mercy of runaway climate change. These assessments indicate that some of that work is being done, but they also show that for some, significant work remains. Dear colleagues and friends, we all need to get on the right course as we approach this new decade. The next 5 years will determine whether we are willing to submit to climate change or we succeed in addressing it. Let's not waste this opportunity. Let's build on what will be discussed today. Let's celebrate where we have it right, and also use this forum defined by transparency to encourage faster, more rapid change in the future. This is the only way we will succeed. I thank you all for being here. I particularly thank the countries that will be making their presentations today. I want to apologize because I will not be able to stay here with you throughout your presentations, but I will look forward to the reports that the chair of SBI will be presenting, and also my team will be presenting. And I thank the team also for their work in organizing this working group session. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ms. Espinosa, the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, for your encouragement and highlighting the role of the international MRV framework, which are central to increasing climate action and ambition, and for reminding us that the GHG concentration in the atmosphere continues to grow, and the science is clear that we're not doing enough to hold temperature increase well below 2 degrees. Maybe to allow the Executive Secretary to excuse herself, we will hold just a moment and then we'll continue. May I request that we proceed? I also want to thank you all for your contributions in shaping the international assessment and review process. The IAR process involves a great many people and a great amount of work, from the country's experts who prepare the biennial reports, submissions, to the review experts who go to each country on voluntary basis to provide their expert advice and guidance to technical review of the reports, to the questions asked by parties, and then finally the parties itself in answering the questions and preparing the presentations that you will see today and on Monday. There has been a significant amount of effort made to get us to this multilateral assessment session today. And I want to acknowledge everyone's work, including Secretariat's contributions. As you are aware, the multilateral assessment is made up of 3 stages. The first stage is a 3-month questions and answer period before the working group session. The second stage, the international assessment during the SBI meeting. And the third stage, a summary report for each party, which is made available on its MA Parties webpage. During the 3-month Q&A period, 102 questions were received from 11 parties. The questions included clarifying and asking for additional information on parties' policies and measures across different sectors, the impacts of policies and measures, institutional arrangements, and how parties can increase ambition. To ensure effective time management of this session, the maximum time allocated to each party will be 10 minutes for their oral presentation, followed by questions and answers. I will take a block of questions from several parties at once and ask the party being assessed to respond to these questions before we move on to the next round of questions. I will give the floor to parties under assessment in alphabetical order. Please refer to the schedule on the MA website for the order of parties. Presenters will be able to operate the presentation via a remote control from their seats, and please remember to speak directly into the microphone, as this session will also be webcast. After the last party has been assessed on Monday, if time permits, I will take up any statement by parties. Distinguished parties, colleagues, at this time I would like to start the presentations with the first party, which is Austria. I am pleased to invite Helmut Hojeski, Director Climate Policy Coordination from the Australian Federal Ministry for Sustainability and Tourism, to deliver a brief presentation. Austria, you have the floor, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much, Emmanuel. Good morning, dear colleagues, dear friends. Yeah, let me say at the outset how important this multilateral assessment is for Austria. It's a huge chance to share our experiences, our success stories, but also our challenges while implementing our measures against climate change. And I can only echo what Executive Secretary Patricia Espinosa said in her introduction, and it was a really impressive introduction. The sense of urgency. We have a climate crisis. It has arrived. It has arrived in all parts of the world, not only in Austria. Just to give an example, we had 3 weeks ago heavy flooding situations in the southern parts of Austria. You may have heard about the situation in Italy, that there was a record flood in Venice, but we had also the impacts of such heavy rainfall in the southern parts of Austria. We had to pay death tolls. There was a lot of damage to infrastructure, summing up to roughly 60 million euro. There was a lot of destruction on power lines, on streets, and so on. Local communities were cut off for several weeks from traffic, and this is unexpected. Changes much quicker than expected before, and if you have listened to the IPCC special reports, IPCC also underlines this. The effects of climate change are much quicker, are much more severe than expected before. And this is also true for Austria. And as I said, there are many other parts in the world, like Australia, the bushfires there, which expand. And all this is a sign of climate change. So climate change has arrived, and it has arrived in a much bigger impact than previously expected. So I would now like to turn to our assessment and what Austria is doing against climate change. I will focus on the mitigation side, but we do also a lot on adaptation, and these events the recent events have shown there's a lot to do on adaptation as well. We have to adapt to situations like this. We had a constant weather situation for 5-6 times within a time span of 2 days, so something which is usually occurring only once or twice at the utmost, we had within 1.5 weeks, 5-6 times. So this is unusual, this is unexpected, and we have to react. Yeah, we received written questions from 5 parties, Republic of Korea, Thailand, New Zealand, and, 4 parties, Australia. All in all, 9 written questions, mainly focusing on the targets, the split between the emissions trading system and the non-ETS emissions, how we monitor our policies and measures, how we enforce the compliance that the policies and measures are implemented, the challenges in the transport sector, and I will highlight this in my presentation, and a question how the green electricity support is working. Let me start with this slide where we are now. You know, we have the figures until 2017. We have also one slide where we see a preliminary figure for 2018 where the emissions go down. But what I would like to show you here is the situation starting with 1990 with key political events, I would like to say, which influenced our emissions, but also other key drivers for the Austrian greenhouse gas emissions. First of all, Austria joined the EU in 1995, so we are part of the EU. This led to an increase of freight transport, as you see the dotted line in the upper end of this figure. We joined the Schengen Agreement, we introduced the euro, then the EU enlargement was another step which is important, and of course the economic crisis in 2009, which is not flagged, but you see it very, very clearly in the figure where the steel production is shown. It's the blue line, the second from above. So there was a huge decrease in steel production, but yeah, in the following years it recovered again and grew. What you see and what I would like to highlight here is while a lot of parameters which lead to higher emissions increase, we have a decrease in emissions since 2005. So we managed to decouple the increase of freight transport, the increase in steel production, the number of households, for instance, and emissions did not raise in the same way, so we could decouple our emission trends from these other developments, which usually lead to higher emissions. So the measures we already implemented are working. This slide shows the distribution of greenhouse gases in the Austrian total. A quite usual figure, the main share is CO2, but also methane mainly from agriculture and waste management. Not unexpected, I guess. In the middle pie diagram, you see the distribution between the different sectors. I would like to point out the share of nearly 1/3 in transport. So transport emissions are a huge part of our emissions, but also industry. So if you add industry and iron and steel production, it's even more than transport. So we are, in spite we are a small country, we are a mountainous country, we are a landlocked country, but we have a huge share of industry and also heavy industry, which cause quite a lot of emissions. Most of these emissions are in the emissions trading, and this you see in the pie chart in the right corner. So our share is a bit more than 1/3 of total emissions is covered by the EU emissions trading scheme. The rest is non-emissions trading. This is a bit an unusual distribution due to the fact that we don't have much fossil fired power plants anymore. The last coal-fired power plant will close early 2020. We have some gas-fired power plants, but electricity production is already mainly based on renewables. Our share is now more than 70% renewables in electricity production, and we want to achieve 100% renewables electricity production by 2030. This is one of our goals for 2030. So here we are well underway, I think. This figure shows, and this is one of the answers to the questions we got, how the emissions are split between ETS and non-ETS sectors. And this is something which is valid for all member states of the European Union, but I think since we are the first presentation today, it's good to keep this in mind and put again the situation on the slide. So the overall EU greenhouse gas emissions reduction for 2020 based on 1990 figures is minus 20%. And this target is split to the non-ETS sectors and the ETS sectors. And here we switch to the base year 2005. Why? We don't have any clear figures for 1990, how the split is done between emissions trading sectors and non-emissions trading. So the first year where we have this split within the EU, because 2005 was the starting year of the emissions trading scheme, it was a trial phase, 2005 to 2007. Therefore, 2005 is the EU internal base year for the split. And the non-ETS sectors have overall for the EU to deliver a 10% reduction, and the ETS sector has to deliver a 21% reduction until 2020. And then the non-ETS sector, the target is split among the EU member states, the 28 member states, and Austria has a target of minus 16%. For the ETS sector, you cannot split. This is system immanent. There we have a certain pot of credits, which is decreasing each year, and it keeps to be a single target for the whole EU. Here you see the reduction path for the years 2013 to 2020. And the starting point in 25. Again, these are the emissions outside the emissions trading scheme. So you see in the figure that the black line is below our pathway for 4 years, 2013 to 2016. We were beyond our target pathway in 2017, and you see here the preliminary figure for 2018 where the emissions go down. But the good news is that we can use the reduction we over-fulfilled in the first 4 years to cover the extension in the following years. And in fact, with the measures we have taken recently, we expect that we can meet the 2020 target by using the banking from the saved reductions in the first 4 years. I would like to show you briefly some of the key sectors. And I would like to start with the building sector. Here you see again that all the drivers which influence emissions in the building sectors are increasing. The floor space, so the flats of the usual Austrians are expanding, they get bigger and bigger. The number of dwellings is increasing. The population is growing since 2005 continuously, but we managed, due to the measures we took, measures like thermal insulation of buildings, change to renewable energy heating systems, and many other policies and measures to decrease the buildings emissions significantly. We promote district heating. There are subsidies for it. We subsidize renewable energies for households. We have recently banned the use of oil-fired heating systems in new buildings. So this is a ban which starts by 2020 already. So from 2020 onwards, no Austrian building which is newly built is allowed to have an oil-fired heating system in there. These are measures which help to bring the emissions down. Of course, it depends if winters are cold or not. So the blue dotted line shows the heat degree days, and you see it's quite parallel to the emissions paths and trends for the building sector. On the transport sector, there's a different picture, I would say. As I showed in the first slide, there is an increase in transport, both for freight and passenger transport. And I have to say, we have a lot of fuel export in the vehicle's tank. We have stated this in our report as well. So roughly 1/4 of our fuel consumption is used outside Austria, but it's in our inventory. So, and this is increasing. We have, of course, measures in place, but you see that the transport emissions do not go down as quickly as we would like it to have. In the recent years, they were already increasing again due to more transport on the street. What do we want to, how to react? We have, of course, programs to improve public transport, so to move people away from using individual cars towards public transport offers. We have fiscal measures. We have a highway road toll, which is distance dependent for heavy duty vehicles. We have the blending of 7% biofuels in gasoline and diesel. We promote electromobility a lot. We subsidize it, the vehicles as such, for households, but also for enterprises. We subsidize charging systems. And all this helps to, not to let the transport emissions grow more and more, but to keep it, in a somehow stable way in recent years. But here's more to do. I have to say. The remaining sectors look quite good. The green line on the top of the figure is agriculture. Here there is more or less a stable situation. In spite, agricultural products are growing. So milk production, for instance, is growing. But we have a success story for energy supply. Here you see that, well, most is, of course, in the emissions trading scheme. But here the change to renewable energy sources has a significant impact to lower the emissions there. And industry is more or less stable, but there are also subsidies, and we hope that these emissions will decrease in the future. And this is my second but last slide, not to be too much beyond our 10 minutes time slot. Let me briefly touch upon the 2030 target. The scheme is the same as for 2020. Here we have the overall EU reduction is at least minus 40% compared to 1990. The split between emissions trading scheme and the non-emission trading sectors is a much tougher one. So the non-emission trading sectors have to reduce, for the EU overall, have to reduce 30%, while the enterprises under the emissions trading scheme have to reduce 43%. Again, base year 2005. And here, Austria has a reduction target of 36%. So that's quite strict, quite challenging, I have to admit. This is the situation as it looks like now. You see a much steeper reduction path than the one compared to 2013 to 2020. We have still to reduce roughly 30% from the emissions now. So a huge challenge, and we are currently finalizing our energy and climate plan, which each and every member state has to deliver by the end of this year. There's also a new scenario with additional measures where we come close to the necessary reduction, but we are not there yet. So a lot of new measures is planned. Currently, it's a bit a difficult situation in Austria since we have an expert government in place, and the parliamentary parties, two parties, the Conservatives and the Greens, are currently negotiating a new government agreement, which will maybe take time after Christmas, and we expect more political decisions towards efficient measures when the new government is in place. Climate change was an extremely important topic throughout all the election campaigns. We had parliamentary elections end of September. So I expect a major step forward in the next few weeks in order that we can meet our target 2030 by domestic measures alone. So that's a quick run through the Austrian situation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm more than happy to answer all your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Austria. I have the pleasure to continue the process. The SBI chair had to take care of an urgent issue. Now, I would like to open the floor for questions from parties. India, you have the floor. Where's India? No. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. At the outset, I would wish to congratulate the distinguished colleague from Austria for a very brilliant presentation. We have just 3 points, all woven into one question, which we will make now. We noticed from the report that between 1990 and 2015, the net CO2 from LULUCF increased by 23.52%. During the same period, NF3 emissions have increased by 100%. The GWP of NF3 is 17,200 times the GWP of CO2 and is one of the new pollutants covered both by Kyoto Protocol second commitment period and the COP24 Katowice decision added to the basket of 6 greenhouse gases, and all parties are expected to report. So our short point is, are there any reasons for the increase in the emissions, and what measures Austria is taking to reduce these emissions, especially the NF3? Our second point is about the 2005 base year instead of 1990. We couldn't catch that properly. And our third quick point is that in the transport sector, I just saw in the slide that the emissions were on fuel sold basis. Is there any plan to move to any advanced methods to use fuel consumed instead of fuel sold basis? With this, we once again congratulate the distinguished colleague from Austria for a very excellent presentation. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, India. The floor goes to Japan.
Thank you very much for your informative presentation. We would like to ask about, so can you hear? We would like to ask about the mechanism and system for monitoring of the policy measures. So according to your BL3, the Federal Minister of Agriculture and Forestry, Environment and Water Management annually reports to the Climate Change Committee and to the Parliament on progress with respect to the climate change targets.
Excuse me, it's hard to be listened. Can you speak louder, please? Closer to the microphone.
Sure. We want to ask about the mechanism for monitoring of policy and measures. And according to your BL, the Federal Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry, Environment and Water Management annually reports to the Climate Change Committee and to the Parliament on the progress made with respect to the climate change target. And if targets are not met, the Climate Change Act triggers negotiations on additional measures to meet the target. Regarding this, we'd like to ask two questions. Does this mean that the progress on the targets are reviewed annually? Can you provide more details on the process of review and update of policies and measures? The second question is that we understand that responsibility for the implementation of policies and measures are spread among federal ministries, federations, and municipalities. Can you provide more information on how the information necessary for tracking progress of policy and measures are collected from different bodies? And if possible, we've noted that in response to the prior question from, I think, Australia, there was a mention to the National Climate Change Committee and also the steering committee that has been newly established. So we also like to understand what are the relation and what are the roles if they are involved in the review process. Thank you.
Thank you, Chaban. The next two countries will be the Republic of Korea and New Zealand, and then Austria will answer the questions from the first block of the countries. So the Republic of Korea has the floor.
Okay, thank you, Austria. Thank you very much for the very informative PPT. I have another question about the transport sector. So in transport sector, the emissions seems to increase constantly. So is there any additional efforts made at the provincial level? Another question is what could be the general structure of the tax rate, and what is the target of the fuel tax, and how does Austria impose fuel consumption-based car registration tax? Thank you.
Thank you, Republic of Korea. New Zealand.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much to the Austrian delegation for your presentation. Thank you also for the answers to our written questions. We had a follow-up to our written question on transport emissions. We understand that an EU Renewable Energy Sources Directive currently requires member states to increase the share of biofuels or renewable energy sources in the transport sector by at least 10% by 2020. And so we wondered if Austria could please comment on how you are tracking towards this target. Thank you.
Thank you, New Zealand. Austria, you can answer the questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for all your questions so far. I start with India. And the first question was on the net LULUCF emissions, which seem to raise. In fact, we have a stable sink in the land use and land use change sector continuously. So we are able to to sequester carbon dioxide in our forests. We have a forest cover of nearly 50% in Austria, so this is a huge carbon sink, but there's also a carbon sink in agricultural soils and a grassland. On the NF3 emissions, in fact, in 1990 we had 0 emissions. I agree that the greenhouse gas potential is very huge, but the share of NF3 in the overall total is very, very small. And we had 6 kilotons of NF3 in 2016. It's in fact 0.04% of the overall greenhouse gas emissions. Sorry,
Only from IPPU.
From the IPPU, yeah.
Which is only 1/5.
Okay. This is 1/5 of the total, to be correct. Again, it's a small share, but it's important to look at it. I agree, and we will watch this in the future, that there is no increase at all. You were also referring to the base year of 2005. I think I explained how this works. The overall EU targets are referring to 1990, but since we have the detailed figures for the split between emissions trading and non-emissions trading sectors in the inventory only from 2005 onwards, so the EU internal base year is 2005. Yeah, and then the split is done on the basis of the GDP per capita. This is the basis for the distribution between member states. I could dwell more about the details. There are some exceptions, but this would lead to a longer intervention, and we could discuss it bilaterally if you would like to. And finally, your remark on fuel sold versus fuel consumed. Yeah, we would be glad to base our figures on the fuel consumed and used in Austria, but the inventory rules are quite clear. It's based on fuel sold in Austria, so therefore we have this problem of the fuel export in the vehicle's tank. I didn't see any chance to change this inventory rules. It's a party-based inventory, so therefore we have this problem in our inventory. Japan, you asked about our mechanisms, how to monitor the progress of the implementation of measures. They are reviewed annually. There are annual reports which go to the Austrian Parliament, and the information collected is done via questionnaires, via meetings with the responsible people on the federation level, the different ministries, the representatives of provinces, and the data are collected by the Austrian Environment Agency, also on an annual basis, and as I said, this is turned into an annual report going to the Austrian Parliament. And the role of the Climate Committee is some sort of supervising one. We had the case with regard to the 2017 emissions, in which year we had for the first time an exceedance of our target. So there is a mechanism enshrined in our Climate Change Act that we need an evaluation, which has been finalized quite recently, some weeks ago, and now the responsible ministries have to negotiate additional measures within a time span of 6 months. So the deadline for delivering results is mid of April next year. And then these new measures will be collected by us and proposed for further adoption and implementation in the relevant ministries and provinces where they are relevant. Republic of Korea, you asked again on the matters of transport and the fuel tax. Well, we have several components of taxation of the road transport. First of all, we have the mineral oil tax. This is a consumption-based tax, so it's added to the liters of gasoline you refuel. We have taxes for the annual taxes, which are based on the engine power for the cars and light-duty vehicles. And we have a similar tax on heavy-duty vehicles. There is a levy for the use of motorways. There is a flat rate levy. It's a so-called vignette, which you have to pay for passenger cars and for bikes. It's a one price for a year, while the heavy-duty transport is charged on a kilometer basis via a system of signal posts on the highways. And then we have a car registration tax, which is dependent on the CO2 emissions of cars. And if your car has a CO2 emission below 90 gram per kilometer, you are exempted from this levy. So for electric mobility, you don't have to pay a levy for if you buy a new car on this. And it increases the more CO2 per kilometer you emit, the higher the tax is. And finally, New Zealand, you asked the share of renewables. I said it's 7% currently, with some view to increase it to 10%. The problem there is that the car industry is already a bit hesitant to have a higher share of renewables in gasoline and diesel. So we try to overcome this problem and increase it up to 10%. But we have also some options at hand where we have 100% use of biogenic fuel, especially in the agricultural sector, and we try to expand this to bring down emissions in agriculture. So I hope I got all the answers to the questions. Thank you for the first round.
Thank you, Austria. There's a next block of countries, Australia, Brazil, and Switzerland. We start with Australia.
Thank you. And thank you to our Austrian colleagues for your presentation and addressing our written comments. We have two additional questions for you. Firstly, the review of your 7th national communication noted that you needed to clarify measures that would modify the long-term emissions trend. We understand you're drafting an energy climate plan for 2030. We would welcome to hear how the Energy Climate Action Plan is progressing and how it would demonstrate progress to long-term emission reductions. Secondly, the review also noted that Austria has information on costs and non-greenhouse gas mitigation benefits of policies and measures for some sectors such as buildings. Will this information be extended to other sectors for future reports?
Thank you, Australia. Brazil has the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Good morning, colleagues. First of all, Brazil would like to express his gratitude on the intervention made by the UNFCCC Secretary in the beginning of the session. We think that particularly in terms of transparency is very important to the UNFCCC process, and we hope that this process here could feed learnings to the Paris Agreement framework on transparency. And I would like to thank you very much for the presentation made by Austria. Before going to the presentation, we would like to express Brazil's solidarity to Austria and Italy regarding the flood situation referred to by Austria in the beginning of the presentation. In Brazil, we also used to fight against floods and other extreme events, and that situation is not different for so many other developing countries. The amount of 16 million euros to deal with the problem in Austria indicates the importance of means of implementation from developed countries to developing countries to support actions on adaptation. But following these comments, I would like to present 3 questions to Austria. Thank you very much, Mr. Rojeski, for the very comprehensive presentation. The first one, you showed the share of greenhouse emissions in 2017, and we noted that transport is responsible for 30% of the emissions. But if you consider the iron and steel production with 15% and the rest of industry with 19%, I understand that the industry sector is the most important sector in greenhouse gas emissions in Austria. I'd just like to know if the emissions coming from industry is related only to the energy sector, or the industry processes are included in this total of emissions that you showed a few minutes ago. The second question is about the use of banking to meet the 2020 targets. Could Austria please elaborate a little bit more on this kind of banking approach? And finally, the third one, building up on the question made by New Zealand on renewables, regarding the blending of fossil fuels with biofuels, we would like to know if is the biofuels produced in Austria or it is imported, and what kind of biofuels is blended to the fossil fuels in this approach. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brazil. Switzerland, please.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for giving the floor to Switzerland. Also, thank you to our Austrian colleagues for their very comprehensive and interesting presentation. In its BR3, fuel export in vehicle tanks, also called fuel tourism, is given as one of the main reasons for raising transport emissions in Austria. At the same time, for the future, the share of emissions caused by fossil exported in the vehicle tank is expected to remain constant at 25%. So we would like to know on what assumption does Austria base its statement that the share of emission caused by fuel tourism will stabilize in the future? Are there measures planned or already implemented that affect on share of fossil tourism in its transport emissions, for example, at the level of fuel taxations? Thank you.
Thank you, Switzerland. Austria, you have the floor for the second round of answers.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. Let me first turn to the questions of Australia. You mentioned the National Energy and Climate Plan and the long-term strategy. Well, we are currently finalizing the Energy and Climate Plan, including also a new, with additional measures scenario, which currently does not completely fulfill our minus 36% target. But as I explained before, we expect additional measures to be agreed by the new government, which is currently negotiated. So I'm confident that more measures will come up, which we then can include in a second stage, which might not be before Christmas, but soon afterwards in an updated plan. We are also working in parallel on a long-term strategy for 2050, which is also due by end of this year, according to the EU internal rules, the governance regulation. And we clearly aim for climate neutrality in 2050 for Austria. This document is more a vision. It lays down scenarios how we could end up with climate neutrality, so without any fossil fuels anymore in 2050. And this implies a huge change of the whole society and economy in Austria. So much more has to change in the next 30 years than in the past 30 years. That's clear. But it's it's not a burden. It's to the benefit of the Austrian industry because we have a lot of experience inter alia in renewables, and it would be overall good for the Austrian economy. You were referring that we have figures for costs for measures in the building sector. Well, this is comparably easy to compile, since these are mainly subsidies, and you can also estimate the investments triggered by these subsidies. It's roughly 3 times the subsidy 3 to 4 times the subsidy you receive. For other sectors, it's more difficult. If we look at structural measures or soft measures in the transport sector, like awareness raising or things like that, or measures in the spatial planning, this has no direct impact on the emission levels. So it's also difficult to assess any costs to these sectors. So here we try to create schemes to have more information on that, but it's a difficult process, I have to admit. Brazil, you asked, and thanks for your kind words on our situation in the southern parts of Austria. Thank you for that. You asked about the industrial processes. They are included in the figure for industry. You are right, if you add up steel and the other industry, it's a higher share than transport, but most of this share is covered by the emissions trading scheme. These are big industrial plants, so much more than 20 megawatt capacity. So this is to a high share, roughly 90% is covered in the emissions trading scheme. Only a minor part is non-emissions trading, and the process emissions are definitely in the emissions trading scheme. So iron, steel, cement production is included there. Your second question was on biofuels. No, sorry, the second question was the
banking, how does banking work?
Yeah, the banking, how does it work? You saw in the figure, maybe I can switch, no, I cannot. No. I cannot switch back to the figure. You saw that for the years 2013 to 2016, we were below our pathway. And this, so we saved over these 4 years, roughly 8.2 million tons, which we could bank and use against years where we exceeded the path. So the overall integral across all the 8 years have to fulfill the target at the end. So what we saved in the first 4 years, we can use for the next 4 years. And with this banking, we are confident that we will meet the target, and the additional measures which entered into force, like this ban for oil-fired heating systems, will help to decrease further the emissions. On the biofuels, we try to have it's 5% share of bioethanol in gasoline and 7% share of biodiesel, and we try to have it as far as possible from domestic production. There is some import, but definitely no import from palm oil from very far abroad. Is usually from our neighboring countries, but it's quite less a figure. So we try really to have this biofuel production in Austria itself, and there are a lot of facilities working on this. And finally, on the Swiss question, on the fuel export in the tank, it depends. In fact, the share depends on the price difference between the gasoline and diesel in Austria and in our neighboring countries. So main drivers are the prices in Germany and Italy, because we have a big problem with the north-south transit through the Tyrol. But we have also some transit, significant transit between the north-west and the southeast of Europe, so passing through Austria as well. So also the prices in let's say in Hungary, in Slovakia are relevant, and in fact they are all higher than our prices. We are thinking about to find a means to shrink this price difference. Currently, there are plans by Germany to extend the emissions trading scheme to transport. This would even increase the price difference. And as I said, we are thinking of comparable measures in Austria, but this is definitely very political and part of the current government negotiations. So I can't go into the details here because this is not decided yet. But our intention is, of course, we have to get rid of the price difference. This is the only means to reduce this 25% share of fuel export in the vehicle tank. So
Thank you, Austria.
I have met all the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Austria. Taking that we have 5 more countries, I would ask the kind understanding of the parties for the shortest possible questions and the shortest possible answers, please. So with this in mind, we move to the next country. I'm pleased to invite Peter Withoek, Head of the Climate Change Unit from the Federal Public Service Health, Food Chain Safety and Environment to deliver a brief presentation. Belgium, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. And let me, from the outset, also echo the importance that Belgium attaches to this process, especially at the current juncture of moving from negotiations to implementation. And as the Executive Secretary said, moving to transformative action in line with science and the Paris Agreement, and that in a context where the window of opportunity is not closed yet, but will be closing. I'm therefore very happy to share Belgium's experiences to date, and also not shy away from a number of challenges that lie ahead us to meet these common challenges of reaching climate neutrality. Let me start with giving you a little bit of an insight in our national circumstances. We're a small country, we're a member state of the European Union. We're quite densely populated. Also, we're on the richer side, let me say, of the European Union, if you look at our gross domestic product per capita. And our emissions are also higher than the EU average, although they have been declining mainly due to a shift in our industrial tissue over the last decades. A particular characteristic of our country is related to its institutional arrangements. Like many other countries, Austria included, Belgium is a federal state. We're composed of a federal government and 3 federated entities on the level of the regions and of the level of 3 language-based communities. The particularity of Belgium's institutional structure is that each of these layers of government and entities has its own parliament, government, administration, its own strategies and policies, and its own legislation, each of which exists at the same level of authority. There is no hierarchy of norms, notably in Belgium, between the federal state and the federated entities. And that in a context where many of the competences related to climate policy are shared between these different levels of governments, which of course means that we have a great need for cooperation mechanisms and for cooperation bodies, one of which I show on this slide. The National Climate Commission plays a central role in developing, adopting and monitoring our climate policies, both in the short and the long term. Our emission profile is dominated by the emissions in Belgium here in 2017 are dominated by the use of energy. About 70% of our 2017 emissions come from the combustion of fossil fuels in mainly the transport sector, followed by industry and the residential sector. In terms of trends in our air emission profile, we have managed over the past decades, from 1990 until 2017, to reduce our emissions by 22%. I'm not showing this on this slide, but it's pertinent. 18% of these 18 percentage points of these 22% were realized in the sectors covered by the European Emission Trading Scheme. 4 percentage points of these 22 are covered by the sectors outside of the EU ETS scope. As you can also see from this slide, on the lower end of the graph, there are two sectors in which emissions have not decreased, but have indeed increased over the period shown here, notably the transport sector, which saw a rise in emissions with 23%, and the commercial buildings sector, which saw a rise of 28%. And those are two indeed challenging sectors for our climate change policy. The indicators underlying these increased emissions in the transport sector notably are an increase of the number of vehicles, but also an increase in traffic, both on the side of passenger transport and on the side of road freight, and more so on the side of road freight. The rise in emissions in the commercial buildings sectors is in part due to this shift in the tissue of our economy, and which led to an increase in employment in these sectors, and thus the need to increase buildings there, but also an increase in electricity consumption in these buildings, mainly due to the development of information technologies and an increased use of refrigerated areas and air conditioning. We have managed in decoupling our emissions from growth. As you can see on this slide, our gross domestic product at constant prices has risen since 1990 with 59%. Our population has seen a moderate but constant increase over the same period, with 14% by 2017, and at the same time we saw a steady decrease of our greenhouse gas emissions, mainly due to a shift away from the use of gas, away from solid and liquid fuels towards the use of gas, an increase in energy efficiency, the change in the structure of our economy that I already mentioned, away from heavy energy intensive and emission intensive industries like steel, towards sectors which are less intensive in terms of emissions and have high added value. As was the case for Austria, and as is the case for the entire European Union, Belgium's efforts in reducing our greenhouse gas emissions are part of a broader European approach. You can see here on the left-hand side the EU-wide targets covering both the emission trading scheme covered sectors and sectors outside of that on the 2020 and 2030 horizon, reducing emissions by 20% between 1990 and 2020, and by at least 40% over the 1990-2030 time period, which was translated into separate objectives for the sectors covered by the European Emission Trading Scheme of reducing emissions by 21% and 43% respectively by 2020 and 2030. And then specifically relevant for our national policies in the non-ETS sectors, a 10% decrease between 2005 and 2020, and a 30% decrease between 2005 and 2030. These, oh, sorry, I'm going too fast. Excuse me. These EU-wide targets in the non-ETS sectors have been shared among the member states of the European Union, and for Belgium, the result of that effort-sharing exercise resulted in a 15% emission reduction target on the 2020 horizon, again with 2005 as the base year, and by 2030 in the sectors not covered by the ETS, so sectors like the building sector, transport, agriculture, waste, and others. Belgium will, in the current under current EU legislation, will have to reduce its emissions by 35% by 2030. The 15% emission reduction target Belgium has under the European effort-sharing decision is not solely a point-year target. It's part of it's the endpoint of a linear trajectory with annual targets, which you see represented by the red line on this graph. As you can see, until 2017, when comparing our historic emissions outside of the ETS scheme, we have accumulated a surplus of annual emission allocations, as they are called, but our projections indicate that from 2018 onwards, we will be looking at a shortage in AEA. So we will be passing on the other side of the linear trajectory you see on this graph. So this will nevertheless not lead to Belgium not being in compliance with its EU goals, since, as we heard in the previous presentation, there is the possibility of using the surplus accumulated over the 2013-2017 period towards the period until 2020. Looking at the longer term, the 2030 target and our projected emissions in that context. As I said, the endpoint of the linear target Belgium will have to respect under EU legislation has minus 35% as an end point. And as you can see on the dotted lines, the WEM represents with the scenario projected, the projected emissions under a with existing measures scenario. The other dotted line below representing projected emissions under the with additional measures scenario. You can see that a significant effort will be needed for Belgium to be able to attain the European minus 35% target. This challenge is well, the policies and measures to be able to respect this challenge will be part of our national energy and climate plan, which is currently under finalization and which we have to submit to the European Union by the 31st of December of this year. But the projections shown on this graph, which come from the draft of this National Energy and Climate Plan, show that with the measures it contains, we will be able to respect the targets, the non-ETS target on the 2030 horizon. Nevertheless, I would share with you that there are some particular challenges involved in being able to respect these objectives, and they are related to the slow renewal rate of our building park, the still rising emissions from road transport, and the challenge of making a modal shift away from road transport to other modes of transport, and generally a challenge of encouraging investors to invest in the renovation of the building park and to switch to alternative modes of transport. I would also like to give you an insight in our longer-term ambitions. On this slide, you see the vision, the targets adopted by each of the 4 competent authorities in our country, which is a first step towards deciding on the transformative, indeed that word again, climate action that will be needed to be able to respect the objectives of the Paris Agreement, with a long-term vision established already in 2013 by the federal government to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 80 to 95% by 2050 compared to 1990. The recent decision by the Flemish government to reach at least 80% emission reductions by 2050. The Walloon region targets of reaching carbon neutrality by 2050, and the Brussels region having adopted a long-term goal that should bring Belgium and Brussels in line with a EU goal of carbon neutrality by 2050. This slide is maybe a little bit too rich to go through in all detail, but you can look at them later on. I'm happy to go into more detail if you like after my presentation. Just maybe picking out a number of key policies that are contained not only in our 7th National Communication and Biennial reports, but in our National Energy and Climate Plan currently under finalization, with on the energy side quite a few and quite a variety of support schemes for the development of renewable energy, wind, solar, and bioenergy mainly. On the side of buildings, one of the challenging sectors, as I told you, measures to increase the renovation rates of in the building sectors with various long-term renovation strategies underway, objectives of bringing new buildings to near zero energy. On the transport sector, the emphasis is on investments in public transport and in soft modes of transport, cycling notably in some parts. Also, decisions have been taken to phase out fossil fuels, diesel, gasoline by 2030, and gasoline and LPG by 2035 in the Brussels region in this case. On the side of support for these investments and policies, I think it's worth noting that Belgium had issued, the federal government had issued some time ago already, its first green bond for a total amount of 4.5 billion euros. We're discussing the introduction of a carbon pricing scheme outside of the scope of the European energy trading scheme, and are making plans for phasing out fossil fuels subsidies. And finally, as an example again of our key policies and measures, the 2 main regions of the country have long-standing agreements, voluntary agreements with industry sectors to increase energy efficiency mainly, and to go to decarbonization. So as I said, we're currently finalizing our national energy and climate plan, but we're also, as are all member states of the European Union, finalizing our long-term strategy, looking at the transition to climate neutrality by 2050 or beyond. This long-term strategy will have to be submitted to the European Commission by the 1st of January 2020. So those of you interested in what Belgium's transformative action would be, I would invite you to look out for that. And with that, colleagues, I would thank you and, of course, quite happy to answer any questions you might still have. Thanks.
Thank you, Belgium. I would like to open the floor for questions from parties to join Belgium. Japan has the floor.
Thank you very much for your presentation and also answering to in prior session questions. As a reply to a written question regarding the new MLV law, Belgium has replied that the law establishes an obligation for the designated bodies within the federal administration to report wide range of information, including GHG inventory, policy measures, and adaptation actions and predictions. We would like to ask two questions about this law. We understand that this is a new attempt to improve TACCC of the reporting. Can you share more experience of this law, including challenges and successes? And the second question is that we understand this law applies only to the governmental bodies, administrative bodies, but do you have a plan to expand a similar initiative to private sectors? Thank you.
Thank you, Japan. The next one is India. Please, once again, keep the questions as short as possible.
Thank you, Chair. We congratulate the distinguished colleague from Belgium for an excellent presentation. The short and crisp question is on the emission of F-gases. As we understand from the biennial report that the base year for F-gases is 1995, and we see that the increase of emission that has been reported in the tabular format is of the order of 100% from the base year to 2015. The short question is what measures Belgium is undertaking to reduce these emissions and what are the challenges and opportunities in this regard? Thank you.
Thank you, India. Brazil has the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Belgium, for the very comprehensive presentation. I have only one question. You indicated the phase out of diesel in 2030 and the phase out of gasoline and LPG by 2035. And you also referred to biofuel incorporation in transport fuels. What would be the role of biofuels in BGR planning in phasing out the fossil fuels? Thank you.
Thank you, Brazil. Switzerland has the floor.
Thank you for this very clear presentation. So Belgium has a federal system with some similarities to the Swiss government structure. In your 7th national communication, you indicate that different entities are competent for implementing climate policy, but that there is no hierarchy between them, but that a national commission oversees Belgium's climate policies. Does this commission have implementing powers to keep Belgium on track towards reaching its objectives, either through facilitation or enforcement? Thank you.
Thank you, Switzerland. The last one is New Zealand.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for your presentation, Belgium, and also for your answers to our written questions, including on the impacts of the system of direct payments to farmers who meet environmental standards under EU Common Agricultural Policies. We wondered if you could please elaborate further on the effectiveness of these policies in the Belgian context, and whether Belgium has been able to estimate or quantify the impacts of these specific interventions in reducing agricultural emissions. We noted in your presentation the decrease of 19% in agricultural emissions, so we'd like to understand how much of this decrease can be attributed to specific policy interventions. We also had a second question about road transport. We noted in the national communication that the number of passenger cars is increasing continuously over time, and we wondered if you could please explain the cause of this trend and some of the policies that you have in place to help curb it. Thank you.
Thank you, New Zealand. Belgium, you have the floor for the answers.
Thank you very much for these questions. Let me start with the question by the distinguished delegate from Japan regarding the so-called MRV law. Maybe to specify first that this is a law that only applies to the federal level of government. So any obligations it contains for other federal authorities, etc., to report only applies to the federal side. Well, it is quite recent, but we have rather successfully used this legislation, more specifically in the preparation of our national energy and climate plan, where it provided the legal framework for the establishment of a federal task force composed of all the competent the federal departments in making up or in bringing together the policies and measures, estimating their impact and their costs, as I said, in preparation of the federal contribution to the national energy and climate plan. With regards to your second question, there are no intentions of extending the scope of this legislation to the private sector. If the private sector reports data in the context of, let me still call it MRV, that mainly goes through reporting in the context of energy statistics, fossil fuels sold, and that is on the federal level. But there are also separate reporting schemes directly from industry to the regional authorities. For example, I would say in the context of the energy agreements I mentioned, but also in the context notably of the implementation of the European emission trading scheme. Okay, thank you very much, India, for your question related to the reduction of fluorinated gases. The main instrument we have in Belgium to reduce emissions from of these gases are actually through the implementation of a European regulation, the so-called, well, the shorthand title is the F-gas regulation, which was adopted in 2014. This would be my answer to the question from India. Brazil, your question about the phasing out of fossil fuels. Let me clarify again that this is only an example, and it only pertains to one of the regions. It applies to the Brussels capital region, where of course transport is a particularly high emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. The role of biofuels in phasing out fossil fuels, we in our national energy and climate plan, as I said, which is under preparation, and as part also of the Belgian obligation in the European context to go to a 10% share of renewable energy in the transport sector. The current version of the plan foresees a raise of the share of biofuels in the transport sector to 12.2%, and the possibility in cooperation with the regional authorities, because it's a shared competence yet again, to 14%. I can give you further details if you like, but maybe we can do that offline after the meeting in view of the time. Switzerland had a question about indeed our federal governance, and I did indeed mention, and it is also, of course, what we reported in the 7th national communication, that there is no hierarchy of norms between the federal state and the federated entities, and therefore we have created a national climate commission to oversee Belgium's climate policies. Now, the question was whether this commission has implementing powers to keep Belgium on track, and there I would have to say that no, it does not have implementing powers. The federal government and the 3 regions, which are on equal footing represented in this climate commission, have those powers. They are not delegated at all to the National Climate Commission. The Climate Commission essentially has the role of preparing national plans, common plans between all competent authorities, and monitoring the implementation of those plans. However, in terms of enforcement, one of the cooperation agreements that we have between the authorities and of which the National Climate Commission stems, one of these agreements, the one that shares the burden of attaining the 2020 targets for Belgium, also provides in an enforcement procedure. If Belgium would be sanctioned for not reaching its 2020 target, then the National Climate Commission has the task of looking into how such a sanction should be shared between all authorities concerned. However, it does not have the last say in this. It only makes a proposal to the highest political consultation body on the executive level in our country, the consultation committee between basically the Prime Minister and the Minister Presidents of the regions. There is sort of a facilitation role for the National Climate Commission in terms of implementation, in that through its numerous working groups, civil servants from federal civil servants and regional civil servants talk to each other about the implementation of policies and measures on their respective levels. New Zealand asked the question about to what extent we are able to measure and quantify the specific impacts in the agriculture sector. We have quite a good set of statistics in the agriculture sector on the level of activity levels, and together with emission factors, we are therefore able to monitor quite closely the development of greenhouse gas emissions in specific subsectors. However, we do not have a system that permits us to quantify on the level of specific measures the emission reductions that would be due to those specific measures. That applies, by the way, colleagues, to other sectors contained in our plans, our national communications, etc., as well. There was a question also on. There was also a question from New Zealand, thank you for that, on the underlying cause of the rise in the number of passenger cars. Yeah. We are aware of that, of course, and that is the reason why one of the essential elements in dealing with the transport sector emissions in our upcoming national energy and climate plan is an intensification, if you would, of collaboration between the federal government and the three regions through the development quite rapidly in the beginning of 2020, if I'm not mistaken, of an interfederal and holistic vision on how to tackle that aspect of the rise in transport emissions, which relates to the optimization of rail transport, taking measures to encourage a shift towards zero-emission vehicles, including electromobility, etc., etc. There's a whole set of measures, and they will be brought together in a interfederal vision quite soon. I hope I've answered the questions you had until now. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Belgium. I'm pleased to invite Detelina Petrova, State Expert of the Climate Change Policy Directorate from the Ministry of Environment and Water, to deliver a brief presentation. Bulgaria, you have the floor. Again, please, as short as possible, because we have a pressure of time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to take the opportunity to express our support to this multilateral assessment process, to promoting the comparability of effort along all developed parties in regard to their emission reduction targets. The Republic of Bulgaria is situated on the Eastern Balkan Peninsula in southern Eastern Europe along the Black Sea, with a territory of 111,000 square kilometers. The population of Bulgaria is 7 million to 2018. Bulgaria joined the European Union in January 2007. GDP per capita in 2016 was around 7,000, and the unemployment rate is 7.6%. Under the Convention, the EU and its member states have taken a joint emission reduction target to reduce its greenhouse gas emission by at least 20% compared to 1990 by 2020. For the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, the EU and its member states last month agreed to join committed to reduce average annual emissions during 2030-2020 by 20% compared to 1990. No individual quantified economic light reduction targets is set for Bulgaria. For the nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement, the EU and its member states are committed to a binding target of at least 40% domestic reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 compared to 1990. The EU quantified economy-wide emission reduction target is implemented through the EU Climate and Energy Package. The package set three key targets. The first is binding EU 20 greenhouse gas emission reduction by 2020 compared to 1990, which includes EU emission trading scheme, where EU-wide cap based on harmonized rules is minus 21% compared to 2005. Individual member states' 2020 targets for non-ETS sector, where for Bulgaria, 2020 target for non-ETS sector is plus 20% in 2020 compared to 2005 levels. The second is binding 20% share of renewable energies in EU gross total final energy consumption combined with the national binding target. The binding EU target for Bulgaria is 16%. And the third is non-binding 20% energy saving through more efficient energy use for transformation to distribution to the final consumer. The total trend in greenhouse gas emissions reveals that in 2016, Bulgaria's greenhouse gas emissions decreased by 49% compared to the base year. Emissions in 2016 were 4% decrease in comparison with the emissions of the previous 2015 year. The analysis of these figures reveals that the energy sector has the biggest share of 72% from the total emissions. Sector agriculture ranked the second place with 11%, and sector industrial processes the third place with 10%. Emission reductions in 2016 are for energy sector decreased by 48% compared to the base year. Industrial processes and product use sector decreased with 55%. Agriculture sector decreased by 53% since base year, and waste emission reduction from the base year is 50%. The main reasons for declining greenhouse gas emission trend in Bulgaria are the structural economical changes due to the transitional process from centrally planned economy to market-based economy. This led to the decrease of power production from thermal power stations and an increase of the share of hydropower and nuclear power. Structural changes in industry, including a declining in production by energy-intensive enterprises and energy efficiency improvements, introduction of energy efficiency measures in the residential sector, and shift from solid and liquid fuels to natural gas in energy consumption. The climate change national legislation aims to describe the existing legal mechanisms to indicate how the measures related to the different sectors are legally regulated. Climate Change Mitigation Act regulates all aspects of climate change policy. Energy Act regulates the activities of production, distribution, and trade of electricity and energy products. Renewable Energy Act regulates the production of electricity, thermal energy, and cooling energy from renewable sources, gas from renewable sources, biofuels, and energy from renewable sources in transport. Energy Efficiency Act regulates state policy of improving energy efficiency of final energy consumption and the provision of energy services. The third National Action Plan on Climate Change for the period 2030-2020 provides specific measures in the sectors that lead to reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. These measures are consistent with both the national policy on climate change and potential of national economy to reduce emissions. Energy sectors includes cleaner production of electricity from existing thermal power plants, transition to low-carbon energy mix, decarbonization energy production, development of low-carbon networks for transition and distribution of electricity and natural gas. Household and services sector includes increasing energy efficiency and use of renewable energy sources for domestic purposes. Waste sector includes capturing and utilization of biogas in all new and existing regional landfills, thermal and electrical energy from the biogas emitted during the stabilization of sludge in methane tanks of large wastewater treatment plants. Transport sector includes rehabilitation and modernization of the existing road infrastructure, introduction of intelligent transport system, increasing the share of biofuels, increasing the share of public electric transport. Agriculture sector includes reduction of emissions from agricultural land and methane emissions from the biological fermentation in annual husbandry, improving the management of manure and rice fields and technology for rice production, optimization of the use of plant residues in agriculture. And LULUCF sectors includes increasing greenhouse gas sequestration and prevention of carbon stocks in forests, increasing the potential of the forests to capture carbon and long-term carbon storage in wood products. The overall effect of the measures will ensure the implementation of the commitments taken and the achievements of the legally binding European objectives. The Bulgarian's total greenhouse gas emissions, excluding LULUCF in 2020-2030 under the VAMP scenario, represents a decrease of 43% and 47% respectively below 1990 level. Under the VAMP scenario, emissions in 2020 and 2030 are projected to be lower than those in 1990 by 49% and 52%. According to projections for 2020 under the VAMP scenario, the most significant emission reductions are expected to occur in the energy sector, not including transport, followed by the agriculture sector, industrial processes, and waste sector in the period 1990-2020. Only emissions from transport sector are projected to increase by 27% in this period. We expect to meet our ESD target, both the VAM and VAMP scenario. The 2020 projection suggests that Bulgaria will continue contributing to the achievement of the EU targets. Bulgaria reports overachievement of the targets at the national level for 2016. It is non-ETS about 10% under the target level for 2016. Renewable energy sources shares exceeded national targets for 2020 by 6.1%. The share of biofuels reached 7.3% in the final energy consumption in transport sector. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Bulgaria. The floor is open for questions to Bulgaria. United States. Who was first? Okay, India and United States. India, you have the floor.
Our congratulations to Bulgaria for an excellent presentation, very crisp, very concise, and very much to the point. We are very happy with the presentation. Our observation is that the HFCs and PFCs emissions have reportedly increased by 100%, and SF6 has reportedly increased by 457.73% between 1990 and 2015. So obviously the question from our side is what measures Bulgaria is undertaking or contemplating to reduce these emissions, and what are the challenges and opportunities in this regard. Also, I saw a time series inventory slide where it showed that removals from LULUCF sector has decreased over time. So reasons for this and what efforts are being made to increase the removals. Once again, congratulations to Bulgaria.
Thank you, India. United States, you have the floor.
Thank you. And with India, we add our congratulations with for a very good presentation and for your concision. With regards to the measures you described in the Third National Action Plan, could you briefly comment on whether those are currently captured in national legislation, particularly in the 3 acts that you described earlier, or whether there is legislation in process? Thank you.
Yes, Bulgaria, you have the floor. Thank you, United States.
Thank you for your questions. For India, yes, we are considering this increase of F-gases emissions from the base year to the current, and the measures that we are implementing are streamlining with the European legislation, and in particular implementing of the EU regulation for F-gas emission reductions, which we should have implement the quality system for import and production of the F-gas emissions. So we're expecting in our new projections for 2030, where we are implementing the whole European legislation, to succeed to reduce the emissions by at least 30%. Concerning your second question for LULUCF, we are also considering this decreasing of removals, and it is the key driver for the fall in the removals for forest land is observed declining in the rate of the forest growth, as the average age of the forest stands increasing steadily over the reporting period. So because of our forests become older, we reduce our removals, but with the measures for implementing the sustainable forestry management in the ahead years, we are considering that we succeed to increase our removals until 2030. Concerning the questions for US, all the measures that is described actually is in the national legislation. They are implemented with the Third National Action Plan, and they are covering the whole legal acts that are producing from other ministries. Of course, currently, all legislations are under revision due to the implementing the 2030 climate and energy package. So we expect to improve and including more measures and more policy for all the sectors in order to reach the new coming targets for 2030 and 2050. Thank you.
Thank you, Bulgaria. We now move to the next country. I'm pleased to invite Dr. Theodolos Mesimeris, Senior Environment Officer from the Department of Environment of the Ministry of Agriculture, Rural Development and Environment, to deliver a brief presentation. Cyprus, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before going to my presentation, I would like to thank you for giving us the opportunity to present Cyprus climate policy. As already been mentioned, the multilateral assessment aims to promote transparency on the progress made by all developed country parties in reaching their emission reduction targets. For Cyprus, this means our 2020 climate and energy legislation and our commitment under the Kyoto Protocol second commitment period. In my presentation, I will mention the EU commitments since Cyprus is an EU member state. I will then briefly describe our national emission reduction targets and the national policy measures that we are implementing and that we are planning to implement to achieve our commitments. I will very briefly describe the progress towards the national emission reduction target that we have achieved, our long-term strategy, few things about our adaptation, few things about our initiative, and of course, our experiences under the international assessment and review process. In order to address climate change, Cyprus, as an Annex I party to the UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol party since 2013, fully complies with the commitments and the expectations of the international and European legal framework. Cyprus has already ratified Doha Amendment to the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. For the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, the EU and its member states and Iceland took a joint commitment to reducing their combined average annual emissions during 2013-2020 by 20% compared to the base year emissions. As agreed in Doha, the EU and its member states have been implementing this legally binding mitigation target based on legislation already in place in both EU and national level at the beginning of the second commitment period. The legislation to implement the target is the cap for emissions trading system covering power sector, large industrial emitters, and intra-EU aviation will ensure 20% reduction by 2020. Effort sharing decision for the transport, buildings, agriculture, and waste sector that distributes the remaining reduction effort amongst member states. Member states have an emission limit for each year over the entire period of 2030-2020, the Renewable Energy Directive, and the energy efficiency target. Furthermore, the EU and its member states have put in place legislation to reach its 2030 target. We have already communicated the national determined contribution under the Paris Agreement of at least 40% domestic greenhouse gas reduction by 2030 compared to 1990 level. We have put in place legislation, as shown in the figure, that will enable us to deliver on these commitments. In a similar approach, the legislation to implement the 2030 target is to a large extent already agreed. The ETS will ensure 43% reduction compared to 2005 by 2030, and the effort sharing regulation distributes the remaining reduction effort corresponding to aggregated 30% reductions for the sectors covered between and up to 2030 amongst member states. Regarding the effort sharing legislation that covers mainly transport, buildings, agriculture, and waste sectors, member states have an emission limit for each year over the period set according to a linear target trajectory. For the 2030-2020 period, member states' individual targets range from plus 20% to minus 20% to reflect economic capacity and mitigation potential. The target set for Cyprus is 5% reduction. In a similar way, the target set for Cyprus for the period 2021 to 2030 is 24% reduction. Now, what are the actual national commitments that we have based on the EU legislation and based on the international commitments? So for the 2020 period, we have to reduce our emissions by 5% from the non-ETS sector, from the waste, the buildings, the transport, and the rest industry that is not covered under the ETS. We have to introduce at least 13% renewable energy and to achieve a 20% energy efficiency target. And for the period 2021-2030, our target for reducing our emissions is 24%. Target for renewables is set to be 23%, and our target for energy efficiency is 32.5%. What is the profile of our emissions? Of course, we do have emissions from the ETS sector, emissions from the power sector, from the cement and ceramics installations. These emissions are approximately 50% in total of our emissions, but the actual emissions that is related with the national target that we have under the effort sharing legislation is the emissions from the non-ETS sector. And as you can see from the slide, the dominant sector is this the sector of the transport that is contributing almost 50% of our emissions, and followed by the non-ETS energy sector that contributes 17%. The waste sector is contributing approximately 12%, and the agriculture approximately 9% in the non-ETS emissions. And the rest of the emissions are coming from the industrial processes and the annual breeding, including waste management. Now, in order to address our challenges and in order to achieve our commitments, we are implementing a number of policy measures, and we are planning to restructure our national plan in order to achieve our targets beyond 2020. So we have a number of policy measures in place from all sectors. Under the energy sector, we have the introduction of the natural gas in our energy mix. We have the renewable energy penetration, energy efficiency policy measures, and of course we are planning to have an interconnection with the other system, because Cyprus, as you may know, is an island and is having huge challenges because of this, because of the connectivity. Under the industry sector, we have, of course, a number of policy measures related with the introduction and the promotion of renewables and energy efficiency, but we do have plans to introduce an F-gases recovery incentive system for reducing emissions from mainly these sources, the F-gases sources. Under the agriculture, we have a grant scheme to give incentives for the anaerobic digestion. For the transport sector, we do have plans to have sustainable urban mobility plans and to implement these plans. We have a public hearing and procedure, and we intend to accommodate useful recommendations that we have received from this public hearing procedure. We are promoting low emissions vehicle through the road taxation system and through grant schemes that we are planning to implement. And we are promoting alternative means of transport. Under the waste sector, we have schemes for appropriate waste management, and of course, in many cases, we are promoting waste-to-energy solutions. Horizontally, we do have a general approach for reducing our emissions, and of course, a key issue is the taxation system. We have prepared one new proposal based on fiscally neutral green tax, and we are planning to reform our national taxation system based on this. We have increased the carbon sequestration via agriculture and forestry, and we are planning to have additionally education and awareness programs in order to change the culture and be more friendly and be on the appropriate direction. Now, regarding the progress towards the national emission reduction targets, as you can see from the slide, overall Cyprus greenhouse gas emissions were down from 1990 level and remains on track to achieve its target under the EU legislation of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 5% by 2020 for the non-ETS sectors compared to the 2005. And Cyprus collectively with the EU and the other member states remains well on track to achieve its target under the UNFCCC of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 20% by 2020. Emissions from stationary installations covered by the EU emissions trading system, which are most emissions from electricity and industry, fell mainly because of the changes in the fuels and including an increase in the use of renewable energy sources. Emissions not covered by the EU ETS, such as emissions from transport, buildings, agriculture and waste, decreases mainly because of the energy use in buildings. Concluding, CO2 emissions reduction can be attributed in Cyprus to reduce energy intensity of the economy, including through energy efficiency, and reduce carbon intensity of energy use. And we have seen that Cyprus policy measures are delivering results by decoupling emissions from economic growth. About long-term strategy. In November 2018, the European Commission presented its strategic vision, A Clean Planet for All. The strategy shows how Europe can lead the way to climate neutrality by investing into realistic technological solutions, empowering citizens and aligning action in key areas such as industrial policy, finance or research, while ensuring social fairness for a just transition. Cyprus supports the swift adoption of a new strategy for a long-term vision for a prosperous, modern, competitive and climate-neutral economy by 2050, in line with our commitments under the Paris Agreement. In our national plan that we are planning to submit by the end of this year, we will have the appropriate policy measure for this long-term goal. Few things about adaptation. Cyprus is a vulnerable country. We are facing the climate change impacts, and because of this, we have structured our national strategy and our action plan for adaptation. The implementation of the strategy aims at enhancing Cyprus' capacity to adapt to observed projected climate change and aims to effectively prevent and address the negative impacts of climate change. The strategy is accompanied by the National Action Plan, which consists of around approximately 60 actions in 10 different sectors. Few things about our initiative. Further to the global efforts to address the climate change, a stronger cooperation at the regional level is a necessity. To this end, our President announced his vision for Cyprus to undertake a coordinating regional role in addressing climate change of the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East region within the coming year. The aim of this initiative is the development of an action plan to address the specific needs and challenges countries are facing in our region to address and ameliorate the impact of climate change and advance mitigation actions in accordance with the Paris Agreement. At this point, I would like to inform you that Cyprus initiative will be presented in detail here in COP25 on Thursday, 12th, in the EU pavilion at 2:30 by the Cyprus Environment Minister. And before closing, I would like to say a few things about the international assessment and the review process. It was a very useful process that improve us to adopt the recommendation made, and we believe that this is a very useful tool for improving ourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cyprus. The floor is open for questions. Turkey, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to state that Turkey will submit a statement to the UNFCCC Secretariat regarding the 17th NC and 3rd BR, which is subject to this presentation. Thank you.
India, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and congratulations to our distinguished colleague from Cyprus. In the report submitted, the figure 2.7 shows the share of renewable energy in total primary energy consumption in percent from 1990 to 2016. And in this context, our question is, the share of renewable energy in total primary energy consumption is on virtual stagnation since 2013 onwards. What could be possible reasons for this, and how would Cyprus like to address these? Once again, congratulations for your presentation.
Well, no other questions, so Cyprus, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. As I have already mentioned, our target is to achieve at least 13% penetration of renewables by 2020, and our target for the 2021-2030 period is to increase this penetration at least by 23%. In Cyprus, renewable energy is a key area, and we are trying to do our best. We do have the potential for having the appropriate penetration of renewables, but at the same time, we are facing a number of challenges, and we are trying to find possible solutions for these challenges. For example, the energy isolation of the island is the key challenge that we are facing, and for this reason we do have plans in order to interconnect and try to have the appropriate technical system to adopt more energy from renewables.
Thank you, Cyprus. We will now move to the next country. I'm pleased to invite Kyriakos Psychas, the head of the Climate Change Department for the Ministry of Environment and Energy, to deliver a brief presentation. Chris, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon to everybody, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It's both an honor and a pleasure for me to be here, because we believe multilateral assessment process is a pillar actually of transparency and of robust reporting and monitoring system. So we are open to a transparent and forward-looking process aiming to building up trust among all parties. So we thank UNFCCC for their efforts and for organizing this meeting. Let me first give you some general data on our country. Greece is located on southern Eastern Europe, and we are part of the European Union group. The total area of Greece is approximately 132,000 square kilometers, and 80% of the country consists of mountains or hills, making Greece one of the most mountainous countries in Europe. Furthermore, we have approximately 16,000 kilometers of coastline. The country has rich biodiversity, and approximately 20% of its area is under Natura protected sites. Population is around 10.7 million. Gross domestic product is 183.7 billion euros, or around 17.1 thousand euros per capita. The GDP has decreased by almost 24% in 2017 compared to 2007 due to the infamous economic recession. However, lately, economy started to recover. The GDP increased in 2018 by 3.6% compared to 2013. Now, about our greenhouse gas emission profile in 2017, Greek GHG emissions without LULUCF amounted to approximately 95.4 million tons CO2 equivalent, showing a decrease of 7.45% compared to 1990 and minus 29.3% compared to 2007 levels. If emissions removals from LULUCF were to be included, then the decrease would be 8.7% in 2017 compared to 1990 levels. In the main graph, you can see that until 2005-2007, the rising living standards resulted in an increase of energy consumption, passenger car ownership, and transportation activity. During the same period, the increase of electricity consumption led not only to the increase of direct emissions, but also fugitive methane emissions from lignite mining. However, at the same time, total CO2 emissions per electricity produced have decreased mainly as a result of the introduction of the natural gas and renewables into the electricity system. After 2007, the decreasing trend of emissions is attributed to the effect of mitigation actions, but also to the economic recessions that the country has faced. Greece, as an EU member state, is under the joint quantified economy-wide emission reduction target of EU and its member states under the Convention to reduce its greenhouse gas emission by 20% in 2020 compared to 1990 levels. In particular, Greece has a binding obligation under the Kyoto Protocol to the second commitment period, which is the years 2013 to 2020, which is a joint commitment of the EU, its member states and Iceland, to reduce average annual emissions during that period by 20% compared to base year. Finally, the internal targets across member states, the effort sharing, as we say it, are defined by the climate and energy package for 2020, but I think you have already heard a lot of that. So again, here we have the EU pledges, but I think that we can go, since you know about that. So we'll go to the climate and energy package. In the 2020 Greek targets, we have, for whatever regards the renewable share target, this is an 18% of final energy consumption until 2020. This target was increased nationally from 18% to 20%. The indicative national target of Greece to contribute to 20% energy savings till 2020 is to limit final energy consumption below 18.4 million tons oil equivalent in 2020. For ETS sectors, as you know, a single EU-wide cap is applied, and for non-ETS sectors, we have a 4% reduction of 2020 emissions compared to 2005 levels. For whatever regards the second commitment period, under the Kyoto Protocol, the EU and its member states in Doha adopted the quantified emission limitation or reduction commitment of 20% reduction from base year. Greece ratified the Doha Amendment on the 17th of November in 2015. For the second commitment period of Kyoto Protocol and concerning LULUCF activities, the activities under Articles 3.3, this is the afforestation, reforestation, deforestation, you know, and 3.4, which is the forest management, will be accounted by Greece. Let me move to the 2030 Climate and Energy Framework. Greece ratified the Paris Agreement on the 7th of October 2016. As in 2020, the NDC for 2030, EU member states submitted a joint NDC, as you know, a national determined contribution, as it said. According to this NDC, which was communicated under the Paris Agreement, the EU and its member states set out a binding economy-wide reduction target of at least 40% domestic reductions, and the EU legislation to implement this target is to a large extent already agreed, but I think you have already heard and seen about that as well. However, 2019 is an important year for taking stock of collective action for parties to submit more ambitious pledges by 2020 in order to keep 1.5 Celsius limit and other Paris Agreement goals within reach. For that reason, in order to raise ambition, a new European Green Deal towards decarbonization in 2050 is under preparation. So, for some key climate-related data of Greece, the total mitigation effect of implemented and adopted policies is estimated to be around 25.6 million tons CO2 equivalent in 2015, and is projected to be 33.1 million tons CO2 equivalent in 2020, and over 45 million tons for 2030. The key climate indicators presented in this slide show a decreasing emission trend, which proves that the mitigation policies are delivering results. For example, the total CO2 intensity of GDP was reduced by 23.4% in 2017 since 2000. The total CO2 intensity per capita was reduced as well by 33.1% compared to 2005. The energy-related CO2 intensity of GDP was reduced by 26.1% compared to 2000. The carbon intensity of total power generation was reduced by 45.9% compared to 1990. The energy-related CO2 intensity of industry was reduced by 24.7% compared to 2000, and the specific CO2 intensity of households was reduced by 31.6% compared to 2000. For whatever regards the projection of greenhouse gas emissions in our country, according to our 2019 emission projection scenarios that were prepared in January 2019, to be included in the fourth biennial report, the total emissions, excluding LULUCF in 2030, were projected to decrease by 27% versus 1990 and 45% compared to 2005 levels. The emissions of ETS sector in 2030 will be minus 58% versus 2005. The emissions of non-ETS sectors in 2030 will be minus 31% versus 2005. As it can be observed by the graph, it is projected that Greece will meet the non-ETS targets, actually will overachieve these targets on the basis of the domestic policies and measures. Now, from the first National Energy Climate Plan of Greece, we are in the second revision now in December 2019, what I'm going to show you is, according to this final draft, the main pillars of this new plan are this restructuring of the country's energy mix. Our star climate policy this year is the elimination of lignite energy production by 2028 at the latest. I think you might have heard our Prime Minister was in Madrid some days ago announcing that. We also announced that in New York in the climate summit, and we are proud for that, and also to improve the energy efficiency in all sectors of the economy. The revised 2030 mitigation targets, let's see in more detail these targets and the projected mitigation reductions. Renewable share in gross final energy consumption from 31% in January 2019, which was the first version, is more than 35% now. The renewable share in gross final electricity production from 56% to more than 61%. Final energy consumption in 2030 from 18.1 million tons equivalent to less than 16.1 million tons equivalent. And the share of lignite from 16.5 to 0. And finally, the expected results in emissions will be a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 40% versus 1990 levels, or 54% versus 2005. A reduction of ETS emissions by 76 versus 2005. And a reduction of non-ETS sector by 33% versus 2005 levels. We will now show you a series of graphs to better understand the numbers that I gave you before. The first graph presents the projected greenhouse gas emissions of EU ETS till 2030. And you can see that emissions from 73.7 million tons CO2 equivalents have been reduced, will be reduced to 49.3 million tons in 2017, and we expect that to be decreased further to 34.5 million tons in 2020 and 17.6 million tons in 2030. This graph shows the greenhouse gas emissions of non-ETS sectors that have been reduced from 62.6 million tons CO2 equivalent in 2005 to 45.8 million tons in 2017, and were expected to be decreased further to 42 million tons in 2030, well below the EU effort sharing target of Greece, which are the red dots that you can see in the graph. This graph shows the renewable share in the final gross energy consumption. Greece has seen remarkable growth in renewables, so we are on track to reach the overall binding target of 18% share of renewables in gross final energy consumption by 2020, as required by the EU renewable energy legislation. And the renewable share in the final gross energy consumption is 17% in 2017, and is expected to increase at least to 35% in 2030. Finally, and this is our last graph, we can see that the renewable share in electricity generation is expected to increase at least to 61% in 2030. But of course, the aim of the country is to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. And before finishing, I just have to say a lot about adaptation, because we have a very ambitious program in Greece based on rigid national legislation, but I don't think we have the time to address that now. Of course, we are open if you want to hear for that thing as well. I'm together with my colleague Ioannis Sembus, who is from the National Technical University of Athens and the consultant of the Ministry of the Environment. We will be happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. The floor is open to questions from parties. India, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. At the outset, congratulations to the distinguished delegate from Greece for a very good presentation. We refer to the section 1.1.6 of your BRNC, and it states that the share of natural gas in gross inland consumption is 10.8%. It has been continuously increasing in spite of decreasing gross inland consumption. So our question is, what are the efforts that you are putting in to reduce the increase in natural gas consumption? And do you propose a planned phase out of natural gas for alternate or carbon neutral source? Thanks once again.
Chris, you have the floor. Oh. Apologies, we missed. New Zealand has the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the Greek delegate for the presentation, and thank you for answering our written questions in this process too. We just had two quick questions. Greece's national communication shows that emissions of HFCs have increased significantly since 1990. Noting Greece's ratification of the Kigali Amendment of the Montreal Protocol last year, please could the Greek delegate elaborate on steps Greece is taking to decrease these emissions, and outline any challenges Greece is likely to have in implementing the phase down of these emissions. Secondly, we see that renewable energy from your presentation on the screen there represents about 30% of total electricity generation. And we note the increased target for electricity generation. So please could you elaborate on steps you are taking to continue increasing the share of renewable energy? Thank you.
Greece, you have the floor to provide the answers.
Thank you for the questions. I would like to start with the questions from New Zealand. For F-gases first, the mitigation policies to control these emissions. Greece follows the two legislative acts adopted by EU, the MAC directive on air conditioning systems used in small motor vehicles, and the F-gas regulation, which cover all other key applications in which F-gases are used. The MAC directive prohibits the use of F-gases with a global warming potential of more than 150 times greater than carbon dioxide in new type cars and vans introduced from 2011 and in all new cars and vans produced from 2017. As concerned, Greece follows these regulations, and as concerned the other regulation, the F-gas regulations, which originally adopted in 2006 and has been replaced by a newer regulation in 2014. This regulation strengthens the existing measures and introduces a number of far-reaching changes by limiting the total amount of most important fluorinated gases that can be sold within EU, banning the use of some F-gases in many new types of equipment, with where less harmful alternatives are available, and preventing the emissions of F-gases from existing equipment by requiring checks, proper servicing, recoveries of the gases at the end of the equipment life. Greece is following these regulations and is expected in 2020 to have a mitigation impact, a reduction of emissions by 460 kilotons, and in 2030 about approximately 2,300 kilotons. Concerning your next questions about the renewable energy sources target, just a minute. Here we can say that Greece has been has seen a remarkable growth in renewables. Their share in electricity generation, for example, increased from 11% in 2005 to 31% in 2018. This increase was driven by a boom in solar and wind that was supported by generous feed-in tariffs, lower technology cost, and simplified licensing and permitting. In 2016, a feed-in premium support scheme was put in place, which is more market-oriented and will help to bring down public support costs. In 2018, a renewable energy sources auction scheme for specific categories of photovoltaics and wind energy projects was put in place. The feed-in premium and the auction scheme are considered the most important policies supporting renewables through 2030. To encourage decentralized renewables-based power generation, Greece is promoting also energy communities through which citizens and local authorities own or participate in the production and use of renewables, as well as net metering, which compensate customers who generate their own power. By 2029, the energy systems of all islands will be interconnected to the mainland, and where this is not possible, innovative hybrid system will be installed for energy production by using renewable energy sources. And please allow me us some seconds. Just a moment. Κάτσε το έχω. For India now, thank you for your question. Natural gas is considered a low carbon fuel. For that reasons, we have a very big investment in Greece in order to introduce natural gas in our energy mix and reduce our emissions, especially for lignite-fired electricity plants. Our target, our aim is in the future to move on with more renewable energy sources in our energy mix, but in the meantime, till we succeed these targets, we are going to use natural gas for electricity in order to avoid and decommissioning all lignite-fired plants in 2028. Thank you.
Greece. We now move to the last country. I'm pleased to invite Gulmira Sergazina, Deputy Director General of JSC Sahil Damu, from the Ministry of Ecology, Geology and Natural Resources, to deliver a brief presentation. Kazakhstan, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and dear delegates. It is my pleasure to present to you Kazakhstan's efforts to implement our economy-wide target towards climate change mitigation achievement. In April this year, Kazakhstan's 7th national communication and the 3rd biennial report have been reviewed in country by the ART. And today I am going to summarize the international assessment and review process in brief. Our presentation contains information according to the outline provided by the SBI. Sorry. Next one. These are some data related to the national circumstances of the country. As you see, the area of our country is 2.72 million square kilometers. Population as of 1st October 2019 reached 18.5 million, and the density is now 6.8 people per square kilometer. Due to the sharp continental climate, the average temperature in the winter season is minus 11.3 degrees Celsius, but in some days or even a week, in some regions, most often in the northern part, the temperature goes down to minus 40 degrees Celsius. In summer season, the average temperature is plus almost 22 degrees Celsius and sometimes up to plus 54 degrees Celsius, mostly in the southern part of the country. In 2018, the GDP by production is almost 159 billion USD, and the GDP per capita is more than 8,000 USD. The resources of fuel and energy are as follows. Almost 41% is oil, including gas condensate, 35% is coal, and 24% is natural gas. As well, we provide some data on the production of the most important types of industrial products in 2018. Some figures you can see on the slide. This slide demonstrates our national greenhouse gas emissions in 2017, classified by the sectors of economy. So the largest emitting sector is the energy supply. The second one is the industry. Next is the residential sector. 10% comes from the agriculture sector. The transport sector has 6.5%, and the waste management has 1.7%. In different strategic documents of Kazakhstan, there are several types of long-term emission reduction targets. In particular, Kazakhstan's 2050 strategy contains a target to achieve a 50% renewable and alternative sources of energy production. The concept on transition of Kazakhstan to the green economy is set up to reach 10% of renewables by 2030. The share of gas power plants to be 25% by 2030. The power sector has to reduce by 15% CO2 emissions by 2030 compared to 2012. And the reduction of the energy intensity should be 30% by 2030 and 50% by 2050. Next year, the Ministry of Ecology, Geology and Natural Resources plans to submit to the UNFCCC a low-emission development strategy. This graph shows the historic emissions and forecasts of GHG emissions under the scenarios without measures, with measures, and with additional measures, and our NDC target. And you see that the NDC target is achievable only under the scenario with additional measures. Implementation of the climate change policy at the country level requires constructive interrelations between all key stakeholders, including the key ministries, business companies, science, and non-governmental society. And to build such cooperation is quite difficult. Anyway, we can report as successful the implementation of the following measures. Ongoing and planned activities of gasification of cities and rural settlements. We included adaptation to climate change and improved mitigation activities in our new national legislation to be submitted to the Parliament this month. And we introduced auctions and financial mechanisms for the enhancement of the renewable and energy efficiency and energy saving activities. Domestic emission trading scheme is operational, and while gaining experience, we are improving it. For example, we added benchmark allocation to the historical one. In regard to the challenges, we are facing some serious problems mainstreaming climate change into the national policies and measures. One of the specific challenges for Kazakhstan is to manage effectively a shift from coal dependency towards clean energy without causing harm to the workers and the growth of the economy. The second challenge is planning for NDC implementation. And we face a lack of knowledge and experience to introduce innovative tools for offsetting and to apply international market-based mechanisms. For example, using an innovative financial mechanism, namely auctions, the current share of renewables is 1.7%, provided by 88 sites, producing in total more than 1,000 megawatts. And we can plan for 2020 and 2021 to increase the share of renewable twice. The achievements are measured by green indicators such as the carbon and energy intensity, renewable energy target, and power generation by renewables. As for our experience with the IAR process, we think that the process is clear and transparent, but more capacity building is needed for national practitioners to be able to implement all related guidelines, decisions, and other technical requirements. As well, some awareness raising will be very useful for national government in order to understand the importance of the UNFCCC reporting process. And lastly, I would like to inform you that we have received 11 questions covering 3 categories. 6 questions related to the category progress towards the achievement of the quantified economy-wide emission reduction targets. 3 questions were to assumptions, conditions, and methodologies, and 2 questions to the category all emissions and removals related to the quantified economy-wide reduction target. And we are ready to answer any questions that you may have. And my last slide, you can see one of the most beautiful places in Kazakhstan. This is the Pulsai Lake, high in the mountains, fed by glaciers melt. And if glaciers disappear, such lakes in the mountains may disappear as well. And we are determined to make the necessary actions so that we protect our beautiful nature. So, muchas gracias. Thank you.
Thank you, Kazakhstan. The floor is open for questions. Okay, and Australia. The EU has the floor, EU, Germany, and Australia, and India.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Kazakhstan, for this very interesting presentation. I will limit ourselves to one question. Page 17 of your technical review report of the biennial report, in table 10, findings 3, the ERT mentions that during the review, Kazakhstan explained that it was difficult to separate energy statistics for international transport from domestic transport. Could you please explain the difficulties and the next steps to address them? Thank you.
Thank you, European Union. The floor is to Germany.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Kazakhstan for this good presentation. We also will limit to one question. Kazakhstan reports on policies and measures in fugitive emissions, stating that it includes the prohibiting of gas flaring and selecting options for gas utilization instead. The information reported suggests mixed effectiveness of this policy. Could Kazakhstan provide more information on the progress of the implementation and how it has contributed to reduce fugitive emissions? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Germany. India.
Thank you, Chair. Congratulations to the distinguished delegate from Kazakhstan, and also for especially the last slide where the beautiful picture is still adorning the screen. We read from section 4.2.3.5 of the BR about the concept of development of the fuel and energy complex of the Republic of Kazakhstan until 2030, envisaging development of nuclear power generation. Our question is, how much energy demand is envisaged to be met from nuclear power in the times to come, and would it be able to replace fossil fuel-based sources and its overall share presently in the energy mix? Thank you once again. And Chair, since this would be the last presentation for the day before the lunch, and I believe you would reconvene again maybe on Monday. So I would also want all my colleagues here to join and give a round of applause to all the presenters. It will also improve our blood circulation. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, India. Thank you for your suggestion. Australia has the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Kazakhstan, for your presentation. We note in your third biennial report that the government's conducting a feasibility study for the construction of nuclear power plants. Could you update us on the outcome or progress of this report and perhaps what impact it would have on your emissions reductions?
Kazakhstan, you have the floor for the answers.
Thank you very much for your questions. So the first question is from EU on the, as I understood correctly, on emissions calculations from the international and domestic transport.
Excuse me, can you speak closer to the microphone? It's hard to listen to you, to hear you.
Okay. So as I understood correctly, the questions from the EU is our future efforts to calculate greenhouse gas emissions from the international transport and domestic transportation. And I would like to add that in September this year, we also been reviewed, undergone the centralized review of our annual GHG inventory report, and these questions were also asked by the international experts, and we will try in our next annual GHG inventory report to calculate and submit our emissions from the industrial and domestic transportation. I hope this answer satisfies you. As for questions from Germany related to the fugitive emissions, we understand that right now our inventory team has some challenges on calculations of fugitive emissions, and in my country we are ongoing the process with the Committee on Statistical on Statistics to find additional data and to improve our calculations on fugitive emissions. The questions from India related to the nuclear power plant and the question of Australia is also related to the nuclear power plant. So our current national policy is still considering the opportunity of building a nuclear power plant in the country, but as I know, there is no yet any feasibility study considered at some final stage. And in our forecast scenarios, nuclear plant, the generation of energy from the nuclear plant in the scenario with the measures was forecasted 1 megawatt and with additional measures for 2 megawatt. And I hope my gigawatts, sorry, and I think my colleague will answer.
Actually, in Kazakhstan, we have a strong opposes to the development of nuclear energy, and it was decided to postpone these questions, or even the how to say the decision was not to build the nuclear station. In this regards, we see that it is possible to maybe to increase the share of alternative renewable energy sources in the electricity sector. So now the question about building a nuclear station is not exist anymore. We will inform this in the next BR and next national communications.
Thank you, Kazakhstan. Australia, you still have a question or your flag is forgotten? Okay, thank you very much. Well, with Kazakhstan, we complete the assessment of the 6 countries. Dear delegates and colleagues, we had the opportunity to listen to the practices and actions of all the countries that participated to the first part of the multilateral assessment. I would like to congratulate all for the very fruitful and pertinent discussions, which reflects the true spirit and principles of the IAR process. I'm sure that we have all benefited from today's meeting, and taking this in mind, I would like now to suspend the session and resume on Monday at 1500 hours in this room. Thank you very much for the attention.